Just hold him once, the Mafia boss begged. What the plus-size girl did changed everything. Park Joon-ho collapsed to his knees on the fish-stained pavement, and Lee Jelani, the plus-size woman everyone pretended not to see, reached for the dying child. The Saturday morning market at Jigalki in Busan smelled like salt, blood, and judgment. Jelani arranged handmade dumplings on her wooden crate, hands moving with practiced efficiency. Customers bought without acknowledgement. Money dropped. Food taken. No eye contact. No thank you. Just the weight of invisibility she'd carried for 31 years. She'd been selling here for 2 months now. Since her fiancé told her she was too much of everything and left. Since her sister burned alive in that factory fire. Since social services took her infant nephew from her arms in a hospital corridor that smelled like endings. The other vendors didn't speak to her. Customers pretended her space was empty. She was a ghost with a pulse, until the screaming started. A baby's wail cut through the market noise. Desperate. Dying. The crowd parted like a wound opening. A man stumbled into the square. Broad-shouldered, unshaven, eyes hollowed by exhaustion. His expensive black suit was wrinkled and stained with something that looked like vomit. His hands trembled as he clutched a tiny bundle wrapped in a faded blanket. The baby too still, too pale. Please! His voice cracked. Someone help me. He won't stop. He won't breathe right. Women stepped back. Men looked away. The baby's cry faded to a weak, rattling wheeze. Where's his mother? Someone finally asked. The man's jaw clenched. She died. During childbirth. 10 days ago. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I've been to every hospital in Busan. He continued, desperation bleeding through every word. They all refused. The doctors know who I am. Near the dried fish stand, 2 elderly women whispered loud enough to carry. That's Park Joon-ho, the syndicate boss. The butcher of Houndy. His wife died because karma finally caught up. Now he expects us to help his bastard child after everything he's done. The women turned away. Others followed. Joon-ho heard every word. His fists clenched. Rage flashed across his face. The kind of rage that had ended lives. But then he looked down at his son. Gray lips. Shallow breathing. Fingers curled tight in exhaustion. And the rage collapsed into grief. Please, he whispered broken. He's burning up. I don't know what else to do. Jelani's hands stilled on a dumpling wrapper. She looked at the baby. So small, struggling for each breath. She saw her nephew, silent in those hospital lights, gone before she could save him. This story shattered something in me when I first heard it. If it's touching your heart, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to see that mercy is stronger than fear. Subscribe and hit the bell. More powerful stories like this are coming your way. An old fishmonger, the grizzled woman who'd sold mackerel at Jigalki for 40 years, stepped out from behind her stall. She looked over the crowd with their backs turned. Then her gaze settled on Jelani. That widow, her voice carried, rough but clear enough for everyone to hear, lost her sister's baby last month. Might still know how to comfort one. Every head turned toward Jelani. She felt the weight of 100 stares, sharp as knives. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to fold into herself until there was nothing left to mock. But her legs wouldn't move. Park Joon-ho turned. His bloodshot eyes found her through the crowd. He walked toward her, each step heavy, like a man carrying the weight of corpses. The crowd parted. No one willing to stand near the Mafia boss. He stopped in front of Jelani's dumpling crate. Then he dropped to his knees. The most feared man in Busan knelt before a plus-size woman who sold dumplings no one bought. Could you try just once? His voice trembled, breaking apart. I'll pay anything. Anything you want. Please. Jelani looked down at the baby in his arms. Too small. Too weak. Skin the color of death. She opened her mouth to say something, but a sharp, cruel voice cut through the air. That fat woman? Sumin, one of the younger vendors, shoved her way forward. Jiwoo stood beside her, arms crossed, face twisted with contempt. She couldn't even save her own family, Sumin sneered. Now she wants to play hero with somebody else's kid? She'll probably suffocate him just sitting down, Jiwoo added, her voice dripping with venom. I heard she let her nephew die, probably too scared to even hold him properly. Laughter erupted across the market. People who'd been silent moments ago joined in. Some pointed, some shook their heads. Jelani felt stripped bare in the middle of the street. Every scar she tried to hide for months was dragged into daylight and set on fire. Park Junho sprang to his feet. His fist shot up, veins bulging in his neck, eyes blazing with murderous intent. He turned on Sumin and Jiwoo. Both women went pale, stumbled backward. Shut your mouths before I... Junho roared, voice like a beast. But he didn't finish, because a hand clamped around his wrist. Jelani didn't know where she found the courage to do it. To understand what happened next, you need to know how Jelani became invisible. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It happened in increments. Small humiliations stacked like bricks until they built a wall between her and the world. Her fiancé's final words before he left. You're too much of everything and not enough of anything. The way her mother stopped introducing her at family gatherings. The whispers at her sister's funeral when she cried too loud took up too much space in her grief. Invisibility had become armor. Until this moment when every eye in Jigalki Market burned into her skin. Jelani's hand remained locked around Junho's wrist. His pulse hammered against her palm. Rage coiled tight beneath his skin. For a man who'd built an empire on violence, he was trembling. Let me go, he growled, low and dangerous. No, Jelani said quietly. The single word hung in the air like smoke. Junho's eyes snapped to hers, and something in them fractured. The fury drained away, replaced by something far more terrifying. Helplessness. Jelani released his wrist and stepped forward. She reached for the baby. The crowd inhaled collectively, a sharp gasp of disbelief. Junho hesitated for half a second, protective instinct warring with desperation. Then his arms loosened. Jelani lifted Minjae carefully, adjusting the faded blanket around his tiny body. The moment the baby touched her chest, the world tilted. Minjae's crying stopped. Not suddenly, slowly, like a storm dying out over the ocean. Jelani felt the baby's heartbeat against her ribs, frantic at first, then gradually calming. She hummed without thinking, a lullaby her mother used to sing during typhoons when the power went out and fear lived in the dark. Minjae's breathing evened, shallow then deeper, alive. The market fell silent. Not the silence of respect, but of spectacle. Phones emerged from pockets. Camera flashes popped like tiny explosions. Someone laughed. Look at her, playing mother. Bet she's already calculating how much she can extort from him. Why would a man like Park Junho let her touch his son? Jelani felt every word like a blade sliding between her ribs. Her arms tightened protectively around Minjae. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear into the crowd and never be seen again. But Minjae's tiny fingers curled around the fabric of her shirt, holding on. Junho stared at them both, his face stripped of every mask he'd ever worn. Tears tracked down his unshaven cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. Then, in front of everyone, vendors, tourists, enemies, Park Junho bowed his head until it nearly touched the pavement. You don't know what you've done, he whispered, voice breaking. Jelani looked down at the baby sleeping against her chest. She thought of her nephew's cold skin, the hospital corridor, the empty ache that had lived in her arms for 3 months. I do, she said softly. Junho stood slowly, unsteady on his feet. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a black leather wallet, hands still trembling. Name your price, he said. Anything. I'll wire it today, tomorrow, whatever you need. Jelani met his eyes. I don't want your money. The words seemed to stun him more than the baby's silence had. Then what? Nothing, Jelani interrupted gently. He was crying. I held him. That's all.
Junho's jaw clenched.
He looked at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't understand. Kindness without transaction. Mercy without motive. Around them, The crowd began to disperse, disappointed there'd be no drama, no violence, nothing worth filming. But the phones stayed out. The photos were already uploading. By nightfall, Jelani's face would be everywhere. Crime lord's new obsession? Paid nanny or something worse? Why would he choose her? But in that moment, none of it had happened yet. Junho wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand. When he spoke again, his voice was hoarse, stripped raw. The doctors said there's nothing wrong with him. Checked everything, lungs, heart, all of it. They said he's just refusing to eat, refusing to sleep. Like Junho's voice cracked. Like he's given up. Jelani looked down at Min-jae. His face was peaceful now, no longer gray. Just a baby. Just alive. He wasn't sick, she said quietly. He was lonely.
Junho's bred hittigt.
Silence stretched between them. Not awkward, but heavy with things neither knew how to say.
Finally, Junho spoke.
Come with me. Jelani's head snapped up. What? To my home. Just for tonight. Until he settles. Junho's eyes were desperate again. Please. I'm begging you. Jelani should have said no. Every rational part of her screamed to walk away. But Min-jae's fingers were still curled in her shirt. And for the first time in 3 months, her arms didn't feel empty. All right? Jelani whispered. Just for tonight. Junho's home was not a home. It was a fortress disguised as luxury. All sharp angles and cold marble. Rooms too large to feel lived in. Silence that pressed against the walls like held breath. The kind of place where every surface gleamed but nothing felt warm. Jelani stepped through the entrance, Min-jae still sleeping against her chest, and felt the weight of a dozen eyes tracking her movement. Guards flanked the hallway. A housekeeper froze mid-step, clutching fresh linens, staring. An older man in an expensive suit, someone important Jelani could tell, stood at the top of the grand staircase with his arms crossed, his face carved from stone. No one spoke. No one smiled. Junho walked ahead, his shoulders rigid, every step echoing too loud in the vast entryway. He didn't acknowledge the guards, didn't explain Jelani's presence. He simply led her deeper into the house, and everyone watched. Jelani had expected opulence. She'd expected displays of power, portraits of ancestors, wealth weaponized into intimidation. She hadn't expected emptiness. The nursery was on the second floor. Pale walls, expensive furniture, a crib that looked like it had never been slept in. Everything pristine, everything untouched, everything wrong. The nurses quit, Junho said flatly, standing in the doorway. All 3 of them. They said Min-jae was difficult. Jelani looked down at the baby in her arms, still peaceful, still breathing steady. He's 10 days old, she said softly. He's not difficult. He's grieving. Junho flinched like she'd struck him. Before he could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. A woman appeared, mid-40s, sharp features, sharper eyes. She wore a nurse's uniform but carried herself like someone used to giving orders. Mr. Park, the woman said, her tone clipped. I heard you brought someone. Her gaze slid to Jelani, cold and assessing. This is highly irregular. The child needs professional care. He needs someone who doesn't run when he cries. Junho interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. The nurse's mouth thinned. I've been caring for infants for 20 years. If you'd just let me. Try, Junho said simply. The nurse hesitated, then stepped forward, arms outstretched. Jelani carefully transferred Min-jae into the woman's hands. The baby's eyes snapped open. His face crumpled. Within seconds, he was screaming, raw, desperate, the kind of sound that clawed at something primal. The nurse jostled him, shushed him, tried a pacifier. Nothing worked. Min-jae's cries escalated, his tiny body rigid with distress. You see? The nurse said, raising her voice over the wailing. He's been like this constantly. I've tried everything. Give him back, Jelani said quietly. The nurse looked at her like she'd been insulted. Excuse me? Give him back.
Junho nodded once.
The nurse reluctantly handed Min-jae back to Jelani. her expression tight with resentment. The moment Jelani's arms wrapped around him, Min Jae's crying faded. His body softened. Within a minute, he was calm again, his breathing evening out. The nurse stared, disbelief flickering across her face. Then her expression hardened. "This is absurd," she muttered, turning sharply on her heel. "I won't be responsible for what happens." She left without another word. Silence filled the nursery. Junho stood frozen, watching Jelani with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between awe and fear. "You should go," Jelani said, not looking at him. "He needs to sleep." Junho didn't move. "You're not afraid?" "Of what?" "Of me. This place. What people will say." Jelani finally met his eyes. "I've been afraid my whole life. It doesn't change anything." Something in Junho's face cracked open, just for a moment. Then he nodded slowly and stepped back into the hallway. "There's a room next door," he said quietly. "Use it. Whatever you need." "I'm not staying," Jelani said. "You will," Junho replied. Not a threat, not a command, just certainty. "He won't make it through the night without you." He closed the door behind him. Jelani stood alone in the too-perfect nursery, Min Jae warm against her chest, the weight of the house pressing down around her. She should leave, walk out the front door, go back to her wooden crate and handmade dumplings and the safety of being unseen. But Min Jae's fingers curled around her thumb. And somewhere deep in this fortress of wealth and violence, a baby was choosing her. "Just tonight," Jelani whispered into the silence. She didn't believe herself, but she stayed anyway. Junho hadn't slept in 11 days. Not really. He'd learned to exist in that gray space between waking and unconsciousness. Eyes closed, mind racing, body refusing rest. Every time he drifted, he saw her, his wife, blood-soaked sheets, the doctor's trembling hands, the flatline scream of machines that couldn't save her. And then the silence, the nurse placing Min Jae in his arms. A son he didn't know how to hold, a life he didn't know how to protect. He'd built an empire on fear. He knew how to break bones, end lives, extract loyalty through terror. But he didn't know how to keep a 10-day-old baby alive. At 3 a.m, Junho stood outside the nursery door. He could hear movement inside, soft, rhythmic. Jelani humming that same lullaby, low and steady. The sound of water running. The creak of the rocking chair. He pressed his palm against the door but didn't open it. Inside, Jelani worked with practiced efficiency. She'd bathed Min Jae in the small basin, changed him, wrapped him in a clean blanket. She didn't fuss, didn't coo, just moved with quiet competence, like she'd been doing this her entire life. Min Jae watched her with wide, dark eyes, not crying, not screaming, just present.
Junho's chest tightened.
He turned away from the door and walked back to his office, the one room in the house where violence still lived openly. Maps on the walls, encrypted phones, a safe built into the floor. He sat at his desk and stared at nothing. Morning came without sleep. Junho descended the stairs to find Jelani in the kitchen. Min Jae nestled in a sling against her chest while she prepared formula. The housekeeper, Mrs. Kong, hovered nearby, spine rigid, mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "You shouldn't be in here," Mrs. Kong said, her tone just shy of insubordination. "Staff areas are off-limits to guests." Jelani didn't look up. Min Jae needed to eat. "I needed the kitchen. There are proper channels. You ring the bell. Someone brings." "The baby was hungry," Jelani interrupted calmly, testing the formula temperature against her wrist. "I fed him. That's all." Mrs. Kang's jaw clenched. She glanced toward Junho, expecting backup. Junho said nothing. Mrs. Kang's eyes widened slightly, shock, then something close to fear. In this house, silence from Junho was more dangerous than rage. "Of course," Mrs. Kang said stiffly. She retreated without another word. Jelani finally looked up, meeting Junho's gaze for the first time that morning. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Do what?" "Defend me."
I didn't, Junho replied.
"I just didn't stop you." Something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement that power didn't always announce itself with fists and threats. By noon, word had spread through the household. The dumpling seller didn't flinch. When Junho's second-in-command, Dae-young, made a comment about charity cases, Jelani simply said, "Min-jae isn't a case. He's a child." Then she walked past him like he didn't exist. Dae-young had stared after her, stunned into silence. When the new nurse arrived and tried to take over, Jelani handed her a list. "He eats every 3 hours. He likes movement when he's upset. He doesn't like synthetic fabric." Her voice was soft but immovable. "If you can't do those things, you're wasting everyone's time." The nurse had quit by evening. Junho watched it all from the shadows. This plus-size woman with second-hand clothes and grief in her eyes, quietly dismantling the hierarchy of fear he'd spent a decade building. And he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. That night, Junho stood in his office with his phone in his hand. On the screen, a name. A traitor. Someone who'd stolen from him, endangered his people, broken the one rule that mattered. His finger hovered over the call button. One word. One order. The man would disappear by morning. It's what he'd always done. What he was known for. The door creaked behind him.
Junho turned.
Jelani stood in the doorway, Min-jae asleep against her shoulder. "He had a nightmare," she said softly. "I thought you might want to see him." Junho stared at his son. Peaceful. Breathing. Alive because this woman had chosen mercy. His hand tightened around the phone. "I'll be there in a minute," he said, his voice rough. Jelani nodded and left. Junho looked back at the screen. The traitor's name glowed in the darkness. His thumb hovered. Then, for the first time in his career, Park Junho hesitated. He set the phone down and walked out of the office without making the call. The photos went viral in 48 hours. Park Junho on his knees, tears on his face, a plus-size woman holding his child. By the third day, Jelani's name was everywhere. Not as a person, as a headline. Crime lord's desperate deal. Who is the mystery woman? Mob boss falls for plus-size nanny. But why her? Is Park Junho being manipulated? Experts weigh in. The comments were worse. She probably threatened to drop the baby if he didn't pay her. Look at her. She's using that kid as a meal ticket, literally. I give it a month before she's bleeding him dry. Gold Digger wrote the playbook. Why would someone like him choose someone like her? Something's not right. That baby's gonna suffocate if she rolls over in her sleep, LMAO. Jelani sat in the guest room, Junho's tablet in her hands, scrolling through the poison with a face that showed nothing. But her hands trembled. She'd seen cruelty before, lived with it, worn it like a second skin. This was different. This was global.
Permanent.
Archived forever in the digital record of her existence. There were side-by-side photos. Her at the market, exhausted and invisible. Her now holding Min-jae, labeled obsession in bold red letters. Someone had dug up her past. Her fiancé's abandonment. Her sister's death. The nephew taken by social services. She couldn't even keep her own family alive. Now she's playing savior? Trauma doesn't make you a saint. It makes you dangerous. Jelani set the tablet down carefully. Her chest felt hollow, carved out. She'd known judgment her entire life, but she'd never been seen enough to be destroyed by it. Until now. The door slammed open. Junho stood in the doorway, his phone clenched in his fist, rage radiating off him like heat. "I'm shutting it down," he said, his voice low and lethal. "All of it. Every website. Every comment. I'll have them offline by tonight." Jelani looked up at him, expression calm. "You can't. Watch me."
Junho.
Her voice was quiet but firm. "You can't silence the entire internet because people said cruel things. They called you a parasite, a manipulator. They said..." His jaw clenched so hard she heard his teeth grind. "They said you'd kill my son. I know what they said. Then why aren't you angry?" Jelani stood slowly, Min-jae asleep in the bassinet beside her. She met Junho's eyes, those eyes that had ordered executions, Ended lives, commanded fear. I've been called worse, she said simply. By people who knew my name. Junho stared at her like she'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. This is different, he insisted. This is the same, Jelani interrupted gently. Just louder. Silence stretched between them.
Junhoes fists umklangskjed slowly.
The rage didn't disappear. It just collapsed inward, turning into something sharper. Helplessness. I can make them stop, he said quietly. I know you can, Jelani replied. But that won't change what they think. It'll just prove them right. What do you mean? They think I'm using you, manipulating you. If you go to war over me, she gestured to the tablet. You prove their point. Junho's breath came harsh and shallow. So we do nothing? We keep Min-jae alive, Jelani said. That's all that matters. The investigation was announced 3 days later. Prosecutor Han Ji-won stood before a wall of cameras, her voice steady and righteous. We have credible concerns about the welfare of Park Junho's child, she declared, and serious questions about the woman currently residing in his home. We will ensure that no one, regardless of wealth or power, is above the law. The headlines exploded again. Investigation launched into Park Junho household. Is Lee Jelani being held against her will? Authorities to rescue woman from crime lord's mansion. Junho watched the press conference in his office, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Jelani stood beside him, holding Min-jae, her face unreadable. They're coming, Junho said flatly. Police, social services, media. I know. They'll take him. His voice cracked. They'll say I'm unfit. That you're. Let them come, Jelani said quietly. Junho turned to her, stunned. Outside, car engines rumbled up the long driveway. Camera flashes flickered through the windows like lightning. The world had decided who they were. Now they'd have to prove the world wrong. They arrived like an invading army. 3 police cars, 2 black sedans with government plates, a van full of cameras and microphones, 20 people, maybe more, flooding through the mansion gates with the confidence of those who believe they're doing good. Junho stood in the foyer, flanked by his lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman who'd gotten warlords acquitted. His fists clenched at his sides. This is harassment, the lawyer said coldly. You have no warrant, no evidence of wrongdoing. We have a duty to investigate credible threats to child welfare. Prosecutor Han Ji-won interrupted, stepping through the entrance like she owned it. Behind her, a woman in a social services uniform clutched a clipboard like a weapon. And to ensure that Ms. Lee Jelani is here of her own free will.
Junhoes jaw clenched.
She's. Mr. Park, Han cut him off smoothly. You'll have your opportunity to speak after we've spoken with Ms. Lee. Privately. It wasn't a request. Cameras pressed against the windows. Reporters shouted questions from the lawn. Is the baby being neglected? Mr. Park, are you holding Ms. Lee hostage? How much are you paying her? Junho looked like he wanted to burn it all down. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm. A warning. Han turned toward the stairs. Ms. Lee, we'd like to speak with you. Jelani descended slowly. She wore the same plain clothes she'd arrived in, no designer labels, no borrowed wealth. Her hair was pulled back simply. Min-jae was asleep in the sling against her chest, his tiny face peaceful. Every camera turned toward her. The social worker stepped forward, her expression arranged in professional sympathy. Ms. Lee, I'm Choi Min-seo from Child Protective Services. We're here to make sure you and the baby are safe. You're not in trouble. If you're being coerced in any way, we can protect you. I'm not being coerced, Jelani said quietly. Sometimes people in vulnerable positions don't realize. I'm not confused, Jelani interrupted gently. I'm not scared. And I'm not vulnerable. Min-seo blinked. Ms. Lee, we understand this situation may seem beneficial to you right now. But men like Park Junho. Are you asking me a question? Jelani said, her tone still soft. Or telling me what I think? Silence dropped like a stone. Prosecutor Han stepped forward, her voice measured and careful. Ms. Lee, we've seen the photos. The market. You holding his child while he begged you. That's not a normal employer-employee relationship. It's not an employment relationship at all, Jelani said. Han's eyes sharpened. Then what is it? Jelani looked down at Min-jae, then back at the prosecutor. A baby was dying, she said simply. I held him. He lived. That's all. You've been living here for 5 days. Because he still needs me. Ms. Lee, Han's voice took on an edge. Do you understand that staying here, in the home of a known criminal, makes you complicit in what? Jelani asked, meeting her eyes. Keeping a child alive?
Hans moed dinat.
You don't owe him anything. I don't owe you anything either, Jelani replied quietly. But you still came into this house and assumed I needed saving. The words hung in the air like smoke. Behind Han, cameras captured everything. Reporters leaned in, sensing the narrative shifting beneath their feet. Minicio tried again, her voice gentle. Ms. Lee, we just want to make sure you're here by choice. I am. No one is forcing you to stay?
No.
Mr. Park hasn't threatened you, manipulated you, or... He asked, Jelani said. I said yes. That's how choices work. Han stepped closer, her voice dropping low. You realize what this looks like? Powerful man. A vulnerable woman. A child caught in the middle. Jelani held her gaze. I've been vulnerable my entire life, she said evenly. This isn't what that looks like. Junho stood frozen across the room, watching this plus-size woman, who sold dumplings no one bought, calmly dismantle the authority of a prosecutor and the entire media apparatus bearing down on her. She didn't raise her voice, didn't plead, didn't justify. She simply stood in her truth and refused to move. Han's professional mask slipped for just a moment, frustration flickering across her face. Ms. Lee, if you change your mind. I know where the door is, Jelani said softly. Min-jae stirred against her chest, made a small sound, then settled again.
Han glansede af her kollig.
The social worker shook her head slightly. No grounds, no case. We'll be monitoring this situation, Han said finally, her voice tight. Closely. She turned and walked out, her team following. The cameras lingered, still filming. One reporter called out, Ms. Lee, why did you choose to stay? Jelani looked toward the windows, toward the lights and lenses in judgment. Because no one else did, she said quietly. Then she turned and walked back up the stairs. Junho stood in the empty foyer long after they left. For the first time in his life, he understood. Fear was not the only kind of power. The mansion grew quieter after the cameras left. Not peaceful, just empty. The staff moved through the halls like ghosts, present but invisible, watching Jelani with eyes that never quite met hers. Mrs. Kong prepared meals without speaking. The guards nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing. Even Dae-young, Junho's second-in-command, kept his distance. Jelani had expected hostility. She hadn't expected erasure. It was a different kind of cruelty. Being in a house full of people and feeling more alone than she'd ever been at the market. The threats came on the third night. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a note slipped under her door while she slept. The paper cheap and anonymous. You don't belong here. Leave before you can't. Jelani held it for a long time, sitting on the edge of the bed, Min-jae asleep in the bassinet beside her. She didn't show it to Junho. What would be the point? He'd rage, interrogate, punish someone, maybe everyone, and she'd still be alone.
Junho noticed anyway.
He always noticed. You're not eating, he said the next morning, standing in the doorway of the nursery. Jelani adjusted Min-jae's blanket without looking up. I'm fine. You're not. She finally met his eyes. What do you want me to say? Junho stepped into the room, his movements careful, like approaching something fragile. If someone said something, did something, it's not what they say, Jelani interrupted quietly. It's what they don't. He frowned, not understanding. No one speaks to me, Jelani continued, her voice even. They bring food and leave. They clean while I'm gone. They look past me like I'm furniture. She paused. It's like being invisible again. Except this time, I can't pretend it doesn't hurt.
Junho ist jahrzeitend.
I'll talk to them. And say what? Jelani asked. That they have to be kind to me? That won't make it real. Then I'll replace them. With people who'll hate me more quietly? She shook her head. That's not a solution. Junho stood silent, rage simmering beneath his skin with nowhere to go. I can't fix this, he admitted finally, his voice rough. I know, Jelani said. The admission hung between them, two people who'd learned that some wounds couldn't be threatened or bought into healing. Min-jae was gaining weight. The doctor confirmed it during the house visit. His color was better, his breathing steady, his reflexes strong. Whatever you're doing, the doctor said, glancing between Junho and Jelani. Keep doing it. Jelani watched Min-jae sleep that night, his tiny chest rising and falling with easy breaths. He was alive because she'd stayed. But what kind of life was she building for herself? The market seemed impossibly far away now. Her wooden crate, her handmade dumplings, the invisibility that had been suffocating but predictable. Here she was visible, but only as an object of curiosity, suspicion, judgment. She'd traded one cage for another, hadn't she? At 2 in the morning, Jelani found Junho in his office. He sat at his desk, staring at nothing, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. I could leave tomorrow, Jelani said from the doorway. Junho's head snapped up, his eyes sharp with something close to panic. Min-jae's stronger now, she continued. He's eating, sleeping. You could hire someone. He won't accept them, Junho said flatly. You don't know that.
Ido.
He stood slowly. We tried. For different nurses. He screamed for all of them. His voice dropped. He only stops for you. Jelani looked away. That's not sustainable. I know. Then what are you asking me? Junho crossed the room until he stood in front of her, his presence filling the space but not crowding her. I'm asking you to stay, he said quietly. Not for me. For him. And when he doesn't need me anymore? The question seemed to wound him. Then you leave, Junho said. And I'll have no right to stop you. Jelani studied his face, the exhaustion carved into his features, the grief he carried like a second skeleton. You're asking me to build a life around someone else's child, she said. I'm asking you to save him, Junho replied. The way you already have. Jelani looked past him, toward the window where the city lights glittered in the distance. She thought about the market, the cruelty, the invisibility. She thought about Min-jae's fingers curling around hers. She thought about the note under her door. Leave before you can't. Maybe she already couldn't. I'll stay, Jelani said finally. Junho's shoulders sagged with relief. But not forever, she added, meeting his eyes. Just until he doesn't need me. Junho nodded. Even though they both knew it was a lie, Min-jae would always need her. The question was whether Jelani would remember she deserved to be needed, not just endured. She turned and walked back to the nursery. Junho watched her go, knowing she'd chosen captivity over abandonment, and hating himself for being grateful. Min-jae laughed for the first time on a Tuesday morning. Not a full laugh, just a sound, small and surprised, when Jelani tickled his belly while changing him. But it was enough. Junho stood frozen in the doorway, coffee forgotten in his hand. He'd never heard his son make that sound. Jelani looked up, caught his expression, and something passed between them. Grief and wonder tangled together, impossible to separate. He's happy, Junho said, his voice rough. He's fed and dry and held, Jelani replied gently. That's all babies need to be happy. Junho set the coffee down and stepped closer, watching his son with eyes that held a different kind of hunger now. Not for power, not for control, for connection. Can I? He started, then stopped. Jelani understood before he finished. She lifted Min-jae carefully and held him out. Junho took his son like he was receiving something holy. His hands were steady now, no longer trembling with fear or exhaustion. Min-jae blinked up at him, tiny fist curling around Junho's finger, and didn't cry.
Junho's bred hittigt.
He's getting used to you, Jelani said softly. Because you taught him it was safe, Junho replied. The changes were small at first. Junho stopped giving orders at the dinner table, started asking questions instead. Does Min-jae need anything? Should I turn the heat up in the nursery? Is this formula the right kind? He stopped sleeping in his office, started sitting in the chair beside the bassinet, watching his son breathe, learning the rhythms of a life that didn't require violence to survive. One night, Jelani woke to find him holding Min-jae against his chest, humming the lullaby she'd taught him. Off-key and uncertain, but trying. She didn't announce herself, just watched from the doorway as the most feared man in Busan rocked his son to sleep, finally learning what power couldn't buy. Gentleness. The household shifted too. Mrs. Kong brought Jelani tea one morning without being asked. Didn't say anything, just set it down and left. But the next day she brought toast too. The guards nodded when Jelani passed. Not out of fear, out of something closer to respect. Even Dae-young, who'd once called her a charity case, held the door open when she carried Min-jae through. He looks good, Dae-young said gruffly. Jelani met his eyes. He is good. Dae-young nodded once and walked away. It wasn't friendship, but it wasn't hostility either. It was acknowledgement. And for Jelani that was enough. The media moved on. New scandals. New villains. New women to judge. The photos of Junho kneeling faded from front pages. The investigation quietly closed. No evidence of coercion. No grounds for removal. Prosecutor Han released a terse statement. After thorough review, we've determined the child is in no immediate danger. Not an apology, but an ending. The cameras stopped coming. The death threats slowed, then stopped. The world found someone else to dissect. Jelani stood in the garden one afternoon, Min-jae asleep in a sling against her chest, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet. Just the absence of threat. The space to breathe without bracing for impact. Junho found her there, standing among flowers that probably cost more than her entire life at the market. You're still here, he said quietly. I said I would be. You also said it wouldn't be forever. Jelani looked down at Min-jae, his face soft with sleep. I did. Junho stepped closer, not crowding, just present. I can't give you back what you lost, he said. Your sister, your nephew, the life you had before. I know, but I can give you this. He gestured to the garden, the house, the sleeping child. A place where you're not invisible, where what you do matters. Jelani finally looked at him, really looked. The exhaustion was still there, the grief, the weight of 10,000 sins he'd never atoned for. But there was something new too. Gratitude, not performed, not transactional, real. I'm not staying for you, Jelani said quietly.
No, Junho replied.
And I'm not staying for this. She gestured to the mansion, the wealth, the safety money bought. Then why? Jelani adjusted Min-jae gently, her hand protective over his small back. Because someone should, she said simply. And no one else will. Junho bowed his head. That's more than I deserve. Yes, Jelani agreed. It is. But she stayed anyway. Not because Junho had power. Not because the world had decided she belonged there. But because Min-jae reached for her when he woke. Because Junho had finally learned to ask instead of command. Because for the first time in her life, Jelani wasn't invisible. She was essential. And that, quiet, unspoken, impossible was enough. That night, Junho sat in the nursery while Jelani prepared a bottle. Min-jae looked up at him, eyes clear and bright, and smiled. Not for Jelani, for his father.
Junho's bred kort.
His vision blurred. Thank you, he whispered, not to his son, but to the woman who'd taught both of them how to be human again. Jelani didn't respond, but she placed the bottle in Junho's hand instead of taking Min-jae herself. Your turn, she said softly, and for the first time since his wife died, Junho fed his son. Without fear, without breaking, Just a man. A baby. A moment of grace. The garden was quiet in the early morning. Not silent. Birds called from the trees. Wind moved through the leaves. Somewhere in the distance the city hummed with life. But here, in this carefully tended space that had once been just another display of wealth, there was stillness. Junho stood near the fountain, Min-jae cradled against his chest. 3 months had passed since that day at the market. 3 months since he'd knelt on cold pavement and begged a stranger to save his son. Min-jae was 4 months old now. His cheeks had filled out. His eyes tracked movement with curiosity instead of exhaustion. He made sounds, coos and babbles that weren't quite words but felt like conversation. He was alive. More than that, he was thriving. Junho looked down at his son and felt the weight of everything he'd almost lost. Everything he hadn't known how to protect. "You're up early." Jelani's voice came from behind him.
Junho turned.
She stood in the doorway, wearing one of the plain dresses she'd brought from her old life, hair pulled back simply. She'd refused most of what he'd tried to give her. The expensive clothes, the jewelry, the credit cards with no limits. "I don't need to be bought," she'd said simply. "I'm already here." "Couldn't sleep," Junho said. Jelani crossed the garden, her movements unhurried. She stopped beside him, looking down at Min-jae. The baby's eyes lit up. His arms reached out. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the easy confidence of a child who knew he'd be caught. Jelani took him, and Min-jae settled against her shoulder with a contented sigh. Junho watched them both. This woman who'd been called every cruel name the world could invent, and his son who'd chosen her over everyone else. "I've been thinking," Junho said quietly, "about what you said, that first night." He paused. That Min-jae wasn't sick. He was lonely. Jelani adjusted the baby gently. "Yes, I was lonely too," Junho said. "I just didn't know it." The admission hung in the air, vulnerable and true. Jelani didn't fill the silence with reassurance or denial. She simply let it exist. Junho lowered himself to the stone bench nearby, his movements slow, deliberate. Then he sank further, down to his knees on the grass, the way he had that day in the market. But this time there was no desperation. No panique. Just gratitude too large for words. "You didn't have to stay," he said, his voice thick. "You didn't owe me anything. You still don't." "I know," Jelani said softly. "And yet you're still here." "Yes." Junho bowed his head. "I'll never be able to repay." "I don't want repayment," Jelani interrupted gently. "That's not why I stayed." "Then why?" Jelani looked down at Min-jae, then at Junho kneeling in the grass. The man who'd ruled through fear finally learning to exist without it. "Because he needed me," she said simply. "And no one else did." Junho's shoulders shook once, then steadied. Jelani lowered herself to the grass beside him. Not kneeling, just sitting, Min-jae in her lap. The baby grabbed at her fingers, making soft sounds of contentment. They sat in silence for a long time. No promises were made. No declarations of forever. Junho didn't ask her to stay permanently. Jelani didn't offer. They both understood that some things couldn't be named without being destroyed. Finally, Min-jae reached out again, this time for his father. Junho took him carefully, and the baby didn't cry, didn't flinch, just settled into his father's arms the way he settled into Jelani's. Safe. Junho looked at Jelani, tears tracking down his face that he didn't bother to hide. "Thank you," he whispered. Jelani held his gaze. This man who'd terrorized a city, who'd broken bones and ended lives, who'd forgotten how to be human until his son taught him how to grieve. "You're welcome," she said, and meant it. Months later, the media would try to write their story again. Former crime lord turned family man. The plus-size woman who tamed the beast. Love in the most unlikely place. But none of those headlines were true. Junho hadn't been tamed. He'd been broken open. Jelani hadn't saved him. She'd simply refused to abandon him. And what existed between them wasn't love. Not the kind poets wrote about. It was something quieter, deeper. It was two people who'd learned that survival wasn't the same as living. That power wasn't the same as presence. That being needed was a gift, but only if you chose it freely. In the garden that morning, as the sun climbed higher and the city woke around them, Junho sat beside Jelani with his son in his arms. Not commanding, not controlling, just present. And for the first time in his life, for the first time in both their lives, that was enough. Sometimes salvation doesn't announce itself with trumpets and light. Sometimes it walks into a fish market on a Saturday morning, sits down on a wooden crate, and waits for someone brave enough to notice. Sometimes the person who saves you is the one everyone told you wasn't worth seeing. And sometimes the greatest act of power is choosing to stay when the whole world expects you to run. This is the story of Lee Jelani and Park Junho, two people who learned that the strongest force in the world isn't fear. It's the quiet courage to hold on when letting go would be easier. It's choosing presence over power. It's being enough. If you enjoyed the story this far, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter and enjoy more story from us. And if this story gave you chills, drop a like and share it with someone who loves powerful romance with a dangerous edge. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you.